Welcome to Neon Cobra. Let's kick into it. All right, so week 4 of project management, we're going to focus on the auditing phase. This one is a little bit different than the others, whereas every other phase could be, tracked and delineated. The auditing phase kind of kicks in really around the planning and the execution phase, and to a lesser extent, the closing phase as well. It's this iterative approach as you're working your way through the project. You're continuously going to be assessing and auditing to make sure things are on track and stable. So consider it like a cyclical review of the work being done of the scoped project and of the project itself. Kind of alluded to it back in the scoping and planning phase that sometimes maybe what you scoped and sold isn't the best offering at the end of the day. So if you're halfway through the actual deployment and you're starting to find look, what we intended to sell and what was the intention, maybe the internet is not great for AVD. Maybe the way their workforce works is different than what was expected. So maybe instead of a remote application, you're going to do a full-blown desktop. One of the major advantages of this auditing phase is being able to capture change control, right? Scope creep and gold plating, which we talked about in the planning and the execution phase, is something that you can really avoid with proper auditing and assessment. If you're going through and you're finding out, look, this isn't the way we want it to, we're seeing a lot of other stuff kind of creep in, extra data, extra servers, things like that. You can then, via the auditing process, submit change requests to adjust and pivot the process. Now, what would action a change request isn't always necessarily impacting cost, right? I know a lot of times people will default to cost only being the trigger for a change request. But any sort of project change, even if it's less work, a change in hours, a change in scope, anything that entails a moderate amount of work, I would say, and you'll really have to determine what that looks like yourself, should be submitted via change request. Because this is really going to be covering all bases. At the end of the project, someone's like, well, why didn't we do this? Well, remember, and they're going to be looking at the official statement of work that you'd provided them. So, well, remember, 3 months ago, we had signed off that you didn't want to do that anymore. Here's your signature. We adjusted the labor hours and, unfortunately we had breach on this side. So whatever the case is, it's documentation and auditing. Now, here are some things you really should be checking, specifically when we're doing any project, but an Azure project. Was the environment scoped still the same when you went to deploy? Sometimes when you first arrive in an environment, if your sales cycle is very, very long, occasionally there could be a new line of business application, a new vendor that had come in. Could be anything from maybe the HVAC guy now has something on the network that you have to address, right? And, Internet of Things being a very attackable surface, you may need to adjust the project from security requirements. Did you find extra software, extra servers, data? Maybe you were scoping the servers, but there's a line of business application installed directly on the accountant's PC. You now have to solve for that, and that may involve an extra host pool or new software permissions and such. So new vendors to be involved. So continuously audit as you're finding this information and ensure you're tracking it and having conversations with the client and the stakeholders. Because if you just try to absorb it on, don't worry, I'll do it with something else, when it blows up, you won't have the appropriate parties, third-party vendors, or anybody involved and ready to go. Second thing, did you run into any issues once you started that you cannot solve for without a larger change? Kind of talked about some of them before, but let's say, for example, there's line of business applications that don't actually function in Azure as expected. Maybe you were expecting to use a VPN and now you have to go full-blown desktoping. These are things you need to account for as you're going through. So auditing will pick these things up and then you can action them as a project manager to create change requests and adjust scope and flow. How is the progress going? These are things you need to be tracking. While on an individual basis, you might have certain timelines failing or maybe things going much faster than expected, but how's the overall project? Iterate this approach, right? Going through, we had this scope work for the weekend. How did it go? What did we learn? Let's grab that, track it, move on, right? Doesn't necessarily have to spend a lot of time, but time needs to be spent on this. Any new changes or updates that need to be rippled across stakeholders. So while part of your execution phase really should be notification, sometimes you're caught up in the work and you don't have time. The auditing phase is to go back and to see what looks like when the dust has settled and who do we need to notify accordingly? Where do we need the document? Which brings me to my final side of collecting notes. your documentation, right? So as you're making changes to the environment, IP schemes are changing, the way people access are changing, maybe onboarding documents, all this stuff that often gets overlooked. And, we don't necessarily want to put onto the service team. We need to either collect those notes and start updating them, not necessarily during the moment, but collecting this information in the data while you're in the moment, even in a high level capacity, is very, very important, right? And generally we'll address this in the closing phase a little bit later, but that's what you kind of want to do is as you're going, it's always easiest to grab the notes while you're there, grab your pictures, make any adjustments, micro adjustments, new tickets for cleanup, things like that. Take pictures, track your changes, very important. And like I said, you don't necessarily have to get them in the system there, but if you've got a technician on site, spend 3 seconds, take a picture of the new equipment, pictures of areas that maybe need to be adjusted, even some things for the service department, maybe like, hey, this needs to be addressed by them later, take it, drop a ticket in. But, be cognitive, be aware, focus on the project at hand, but also be tracking and collecting notes. So that's really much the auditing phase. It is a continuative approach. And then it will sort of all culminate into the last video of closing, which will be coming up very shortly. Catch you next time.